All right, guys, so this is going to be the recording on how to do the watercolor background. Like I said, and I will repeat it again just so that it's on the video, that if you guys end up having to wait and for Wednesday's video, because I'm going to show you guys how to do something similar to this. It won't look exactly the same, but if you don't have watercolor at home, you will have the opportunity to be able to do this with marker as well as color pencils. So I can show you how to get some of these same textures with those, okay? So I do want to show you a little bit of the process. I do want to give you the correct vocabulary just in case you do take a painting class later. What we're going to be working with as far as the technique is called a wet on wet process. And that is where we wet the actual paper and then we take the wet paint, which you'll see right now what that is, because we'll get the wet paint first ready before we wet the paper. And then at that point, you're putting the stuff that is a little bit more diluted onto the wet and it starts to spread and leaves a very light colored background while still applying textures and so forth on top of it, okay? So this is called, again, wet on wet. We have other techniques like dry on dry, dry on wet, wet on dry. And so it's a little bit different when you do it in it's a different application with each one. But this one, again, is going to be called wet on wet. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to scoot my paper over to the side because we're going to first get the pigment ready. Now, if you notice that these particular palettes, that's what I like about this particular brand, Prang, it comes with its own little palette. Some of the Crayolas have the same. But the reason why they sell it like this is not just to protect the paint, but to be able to use the surfaces here as a palette to be able to prep your paint when you're doing this type of application. So a lot of people don't know that. They want to keep it super clean and immaculate. And they're like, oh, look, she has it very dirty. She doesn't keep her paints clean and so forth. When in actuality, this actually helps a lot because this, I'm not going to clean it because I know this is still good paint to use. The thing about watercolor that I love to talk about is that it is very forgiving. A lot of people are like, man, watercolor must be hard because, you have to manipulate it and this and that, which is on the contrary. The reason why it's the easiest paint to paint with is because if you mess up, all you have to do is re-wet it in order to move those little specific areas to be able to fix the spots that you feel like you messed up on, okay? So that's why I know not to clean this because this I can reuse at some time. So at this point, I'm going to show you guys first how to prep the paint that what is considered the wet paint, okay? And what you're going to do is you're going to take a brush, preferably something that's why I said, those of you guys that bought the packs that have the variety of sizes, awesome. And if you didn't, that's okay. You can use the same brush. So even though it's a smaller brush, let's say if you guys have either this size or usually what comes in the packs. Let me see if I can have it's usually somewhere about like this size of brush. If not, maybe just a little bit bigger, because they're not pointy. Usually the ones that come with it are a little bit more flat. So it's okay if your brush is that size. You can still do the same thing. It'll take a little bit longer. But what I like about the larger brushes, if you did buy a pack that has a variety of sizes, is that you can use the bigger brushes just to grab, it's called soaking up the water. So if I come over here and I just put it in the water, my brush will absorb whatever water is in there. And then I'm gonna come over here to my palette and notice that this palette, that's what I like about the Prime boxes, is that it has separate little areas so I can make separate colors at, all together on the same surface. If you don't, you can always use this side, but I like that it's got these little areas where I can just go like this and I'm going to drag my brush off and remove the water and kind of start putting it into a little area here, to try to make a little puddle. If like in Brandon's case, how you're present here, Brandon, how I gave you the round little dish, you can use something like that too. So if you don't have this, let's say you just got a watercolor pack that doesn't necessarily have this style, you can always get a separate little dish, or if you guys have a paper plate, these are super messy, but you can tell because I paint a lot. But each little area has its own little separate area. So he can grab his is a lot cleaner. He can do that to one of these little spots and still get the same technique of dropping off the water in a specific location, okay? So at this point, I'm just gonna keep putting water And so I'm just gonna keep going and I'm gonna apply as much water in this little area because I want, like I said, I want to make a little puddle. So you guys should be doing the same. Just gonna drop off the water. And I'm using the bigger brush. If you're using a smaller brush, like you're using one of these, this size, it's gonna take you longer to do that. So if you are very gentle and you wanna just drip the water in there, I mean, you can make a mess. That's why I say be careful. It's really better just to take the water and just drop it off as much as you can. So you just it's called loading the brush. You wanna load the brush with water and just come here and drop it off. So see, I can do it still with the smaller brush. I'm gonna load the brush, drop it off, load the brush, drop it off. And I'm just creating, you can see how much water I've got in here. I've got a little puddle going on. And then once you get a good amount of water, so you can kind of see like a good puddle here. If I was letting Brandon know, just because he has his dish, one of those little circles, just make sure you have enough water in one of those little circles. Like you want to fill one of the circles, okay? So at this point, now that I've got enough water in here, now I'm going to pick a color. Now I already have purple here. So if I want to go ahead and use my purple and just kind of push it into that water to start making a color, great. And if you don't, then what you would do is starting today, students will not get sent to the library unless you have a number that lets us know here in the office, and we will make accommodations. But they should be following their schedule. Students need to follow their schedule, or if they are with a teacher, a particular teacher the whole day, then that is also allowed. But no student should be sent to the library. Again, if there's any questions on that, call the office. Thank you. So at this point, sorry guys, they might be saying announcements, so hopefully it's not too much during the video. But at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna, because I know that my brush is wet, I'm gonna get a little bit more purple because I do want a little bit deeper. So I'm gonna grab some of that color, drop it off in the water, and then I want to just make a consistency on this of, so I'm gonna grab a little bit more. So the dark part of this is not going to be super dark. You can notice that I can still see through it. Like if I look at these areas, and I want to keep it light because I would rather start off light and have to add more paint rather than go too dark, which I will show you some examples of that, of what some of the students did in the past after I go over this. And then you're going to see, man, if it's too dark, you can't really draw on top of it with some of the color pencils because it's too dark at that point. Okay, so keep it light. You know, again, if you're like, well, I want a little bit more color, then that's fine, because as you apply, you can add some water to that background, but just don't make it like so dark that you can't see through the water. So you can see here that I can still see the surface on the bottom. Okay, so I'm just going to make my puddle of water here, of colored water, and I already have it ready. So now I'm going to move my cup out of the way so you won't see it on camera, because I do need to show you guys, of course, the paper. So I am going to, at this point, bring my paper back now that I already have this particular amount already set. Not that I'm probably going to use, I probably won't make more because I probably will, but just to kind of give you an idea. So if you're only watching this video because you don't have the materials yet and you can kind of see how much I'm making, as I'm doing this, you're like, no, I like that look. I want to keep it like that. I want to make more than what she made. You can always make double the amount if that's the case, okay? So now at this time, what I'm going to end up doing is I want to make sure that my brush is clean at first. Even though I know I'm going to be using purple, I just want to get in the good practice of making sure that when I do the wet on wet practice, that I keep my brushes clean. So I'm going to make sure that I remove whatever I can, because if I move it, you can kind of see it still has some purple on there, even though it looks clean. So I'm going to make sure that I stick my brush back in the water, come over here, and then with a paper towel, just make sure, and you can see that now it's pretty much clean at this point, okay? So that's why it's always good to have paper towels here. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush, dip it in the water. So I'm loading the brush. I'm going to come over here and start off on a corner, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start wetting my paper. Now, I don't want to wet the whole thing yet. I want to work on it section by section, because if I wet the whole thing, my water is going to dry, and then it's not going to be considered wet on wet because it's dry. So I'm going to just keep going, making sure that it's loaded with water here. Then I'm going to come and get my color. So I'm going to lift some of that, and then I'm just going to drop it here and kind of just touch, so that way the color starts to spread in those areas. So I'm just gonna grab some more and I'm just gonna make sure that it's just a hint of color. Some spots are gonna be darker than others because you see how the puddles are forming in here, and that's what we want. We want texture. So if you want it darker, like you feel, well, this is too light, then instead of grabbing this here, I'm gonna just grab some of the paint and drop it off here so that it's darker. But it's like I said, some people, when they do this technique, they go too dark too fast, and then it does not look good. So just be very careful with it. If you want to go and darken some spots and not others, then touch and go, okay? So I'm just gonna keep moving. I don't want the edges of where I had stopped to dry, because if I do that, if anybody has ever worked with watercolor before, you'll notice that as you are dragging those colors to the opposite side, and then some spots dry, you get what's called a watermark, where you'll see where you stopped and where you started. So we don't want that effect. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna make sure that I continue wetting. So I'm only gonna go so far because I know that I can work within the time from this drying. I'm gonna grab some more and I'm gonna just drop it off in these areas. And this is just how we get a colored background, and we can do it pretty fast, and it should dry pretty fast too, to where I get some textures in the back. I like the way this was dark on this spot, so I'm gonna put a little bit here, make sure that I spread it around quickly before it dries to where it's, I don't want it too dark, but I do wanna spread it around in this spot right here. And then I'm gonna come here, I'm gonna keep wetting this side first. I am going to wet here so that it doesn't dry out on me, but I'm gonna work on this bottom part first. So this is called wet on wet, guys, and I wet here because I accidentally dropped there and I don't want it to dry and cause a watermark. So this is what's called wet on wet. See, I only get this part and then I spread it to the lighter area if you're going to want some darker areas. And then if you feel like, man, there's too much paint on this and I don't want it to dry like that, then you can get your tissue paper and you can, just by touching it, absorb some of that paint so that way it's not too dark, and just add more water to it if you want it to get a little bit lighter. So these are just little tricks to make sure that you're not going to have stuff and spots that are too dark, okay? But I want to keep moving all the way to the end. Of course, if you guys have watercolor paper, the one that I showed you that's a little bit thicker, you have more control over this. When you're using the stuff that is for copy paper, it's not meant for this. We can use it, but it's not necessarily meant for this particular type. But sometimes that's all what we've got. So you just work with what you've got. So I'm gonna put a couple of dark spots there so that way I can make sure that this gets moved with water. I don't want it to be that dark. And then just continuously moving your way out. And if you want to do multiple colors, I'm using just purple, but if you guys want to use multiple colors, you can. I usually do a two-tone. I'll pick two colors to do this, and I will add another color right now once I'm done adding the purple, but after. So I'm just going to add some of this just to make sure that I use it. Even if this were to dry over here where I have the wet on wet, I know I can always use it again later. So this is why I never clean, especially if I'm going to be using that color. So I'm going to put just a couple more dark spots, just a few, and then just make sure it spreads with the water. And then I think the other color that I'm going to use on this is going to be blue. So with the blue, I do want to make sure that I'm not going to make the colored water. Now it's a little bit watery in here, so it's still considered the wet on wet technique. So I'm just going to add blue in some spots, make sure that it's on areas, of course, that are still wet and not dry. So I want to put a hint of blue here because it doesn't have enough of the purple. So might as well add my blue in this section. But if I were to have used a lot less water, because like I said, I do have technically a little tiny puddle in here, that would be considered dry on wet. That's the dry on wet technique. Dry just means that you're using so little water that it's dry paint technically. And I'm gonna put a little bit of blue in here, make sure that it spreads while it's still wet in here. I'm gonna put just a little bit of blue. So we're just thinking of textures at this point. It doesn't have to be completely 100%, what's the word? It doesn't have to be 100% even. We don't want it even. We want some darker spots, some lighter spots. And if you want to go darker, I don't recommend it. Try to stay as this light. We're just doing a background, guys. We're going to draw on top of this. So like I said, if you go too dark, you're not going to be able to draw on it. So just be very careful when you're adding. I'm going to put a little bit of blue here because for me, this is a little bit too light of an area compared to everything else. But I just want to make sure that I'm kind of evenly based while still having textures around. Okay. Now, if you accidentally got too dark, like I don't want that dark. Okay, well, just get the tissue paper, remove it a little bit while it's still wet, and then you can kind of lighten up some of the spots. Okay. If you feel like it's still too dark, it's probably because you have to add a little bit more water first before you do the removal. Okay. Now, I don't like it just like this. I want more texture. For me, I wanted to have, I don't know if you guys have ever seen like where they splatter paint and stuff like that, just to kind of create some textures. There's a way to do it and a way not to do it. I always get kids who are like, I love splats, and they'll get like, I'm gonna dry my brush because I don't want it to happen on mine, but they'll get it and they'll start going like this. They think they're Jackson Pollock and they start splatting everything everywhere. The problem with that is it's not controlled and it's gonna get everywhere. Like if you guys were here face to face, you'd probably be getting color on everybody's paper just because you're going like this and flicking the paint. In order to do it a controlled way, guys, what you want to do is you want to take, I'm going to use this size of brush just because I know it's a little bit easier for the size of paper that I have. If all you have is the big brush, you can still do the same with the big brush, but I'm going to pick a color that'll contrast just a little bit. I kind of like the blues, and that I have so little of it. I do want to use blue for the first one just because it's a darker color. So I'm loading my brush first with water just to make sure that it's soft. And when I go like this, that my, sometimes when they're so stiff, they're not going to move. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to pick up some of the blue. I don't have a lot of water on this because I did remove a little bit here. So I know I'm going to be able to have a darker color while it still can move. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load my brush with paint. You can see how dark that tip is. So I know there's color in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to start going like this and tapping it. And you can see that this is a little bit more controlled rather than splatting all over the place. I can control where I want the blue just by going like this and tapping it lightly. Okay, so it's just a light tap. You don't have to hit it too hard. If it's not coming out, then go a little bit harder until you actually see the little splats. Okay, but this will help create texture. Those of you guys that are deciding to do the fish, this is actually an awesome texture, especially. Same thing with the flower as well. And if you decide to do the eye, because it does create that texture that it wouldn't be there, it would just be flat. However, for the fish, it almost looks like there's little particles floating in the water, or like sometimes bubbles or things like that. So that's why if you're gonna for sure do the goldfish, because that's the one you liked out of all the drawings I taught you, I would for sure create this particular texture. Now you're gonna notice, because my paper is wet still, do you notice how they're starting to expand? They don't look like little tiny dots. They're starting to be a little fuzzy. So if you want more of the hard look, like where they just look like dots rather than where they start to fade, then you need to wait for your paper to dry a little bit more before you do this same technique. You still have to do the same where it's a little bit wet, getting a little bit and tapping, but wait till the background dries just a little bit before you apply it if you want them to be more sharp. I like both. I like where it has some of this and then some a little bit more sharp. So I'm gonna leave the blue like this, let it dry a little bit. And then once the background is dry, I'll do the same thing, but using the purple. That way I have the two colors with the splats, okay? Now, other textures that you can add, which I am going to add right now, because I do like the technique where some is blurry and some is sharp. I'm gonna add just with the same color, these small little lines just to create more texture in it. And you'll see some people liked it, some people didn't on the examples that I'll show you in just a little bit after finishing this. But I do, like I said, I like the both. So on this one, I'm actually gonna leave that blue on there. I'm gonna actually touch the purple a little bit. I don't ever recommend going from color to color, but because I know I already used that splat and I took off the majority of the blue, it won't really hurt the purple, especially since they're very similar in tone. So I'm just gonna grab a little bit of the purple. If you feel like you got like a whole different color, let's say you are working with green and you don't want to put it in the purple, then just clean your brush first before you do it, okay? And it's just by wetting the brush and then making sure that it's clean the way I showed you guys on using the napkins, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create almost like these little vines, almost like what I told you guys when you do the texture in the eye, if you wanted to do the little veins, you know, that kind of marble effect almost. So I'm gonna go ahead and start at a corner, and I'm just gonna kind of be very random with the line, and I'm just gonna drop it off. You know, if I feel, it's a little bit too dark, then just clean a little bit off, and then you start dragging, and then you can have some areas that are dark. So I'm gonna pick up some of this part, and then you can have some areas that are light, but I'm just gonna be taking out some random. Remember, some of this is, think of it like a lightning bolt almost. Some of this is gonna be blurred out because of how my background is still wet. And so I had some kids that liked this look the previous year, and then I had some kids that are like, no, I don't like that, I'm not gonna add it. You don't have to add this. I'm just showing you guys textures of things that you can add. And see, I need this to be a little darker. So I'm gonna grab some of the purple, because I still want to be able to see it. So some should be dark, some should be light. If you've ever paid attention to marble, like people who actually have it, whether you have it in your house or you just have seen it before, like on textures, some parts are darker and some parts are lighter. And that's what makes it look more natural, okay? So I'm gonna do the same thing on the opposite side, but I'm gonna do it also with the purple. I'm coming over here, just making sure that it's not too dark, not too light. And I'm gonna come over here and be random with this line. And I wanna dry this out a little bit more. I know it's gonna spread, and that's okay. So I know I want some areas that are gonna be light, because after this is completely dry, I'm gonna go ahead and go with the blue and do the same texture. So I'm just gonna get a little bit of it there. This area had a little bit too much water. So if I let it dry just a little bit more, I can just go back and make that line a little bit more defined. Remember, some parts can be darker, some parts can be lighter, and that's what makes it look a little bit more natural anyways. So some of you guys knowing now that, you know, like I'll give materials to the kids who come in. If you guys are like, you know what, I'm just gonna come in at least on the days that I have Miss Palmenes, just so I can get materials for the artwork, that's fine too. We can spread you guys around here. I'm not getting too many kids as it is. So just let me know if you're coming in, so that way I can accommodate for you, okay? I know I want that a little bit more defined. So I'll just kind of play around with it like that. I might put another one right here of the purple. Here. And then I know I'm not going to put too much of this, because I know I'm going to want some of the blue. So I'm not going to go too heavy. I'll just put a few, maybe like one going this way. And it's just very random, guys. I know I'm going to put blue in here, so I'm going to not put too much. I'll probably, this is as much as I'm going to do of the purple. I just want to make some spots a little bit darker. So I'll go wait till it dries just a tiny bit, and then come back with just the color, not necessarily the water. I have one coming this way. Now, watercolor, I can be super detailed with watercolor. Like if you guys take me for painting, I do go over how we can create using watercolor to a certain degree, to where you can actually control it. This is not the controlled style of watercolor. This is just more randomness and so forth, as far as being wet on wet, because it's the wet on wet technique. If I was doing dry on wet or dry on dry, that's where you get very detailed with watercolor. I'm only showing you one thing that you can do with watercolor. If you look at my painting class, and you look at some of the stuff I've done with the painting class and previous, I don't have them here. I have them actually at the house, because that's where we were doing most of the watercolor stuff. But you can get super, super detailed with watercolor, almost like if it was a drawing. Okay, that's why I like watercolor, because if I make a mistake, let's just say you did this, and you're like, I don't like that, it's too dark. Once it's completely dry, if I were to take water and re-wet that area, come back with a napkin and dry it up, you can pick up that actual color. That's why I like it, because watercolor is almost like a pencil, or you can erase just by using the water, okay? You can manipulate certain things, and you know, like I said, if you guys take me for painting, I'll show you guys those particular techniques later on how to actually use this to be able to get detailed stuff, all right? Very loose, but on purpose, because I wanted to show you guys at least one technique in case you guys don't ever take an art class again, on how you can draw on top of this and use this as a simple background. So for those teachers who ask you, I need you to do a drawing by tomorrow, and it has to be 100% completed, background and all, you know, you can do something like this, just draw something simple on top of it because it's got all that color. You guys can finish it easily in a day and make it look like a completed piece. Even if this was bigger, it would still take you about the same amount of time to do it, okay, to accomplish this. So I'm gonna let this dry a little bit more. If you can't wait because you're like, oh, I want to do this already, I want it to be finished, and you want to do the splats already for them to look a little bit more solid compared to the ones that are a little bit more dragged, you know, with the transition, take a, now that it's kind of set at least, take a paper towel, and then you're gonna go and you're just going to pick up the water on the areas that are still with like a, like, cause I can kind of see a slight little puddle on some of this. There's some here, there's some here. Like if I'm really being nitpicky just to make sure it's not gonna bleed. Here, and you're just basically just touching it, just picking up whatever is still wet with water. Because at this point it's dry enough to where that paint's not going to come out. It's just going to be the water that you're taking up. If you do take up paint, it's so little, it's not noticeable on the paper. So you just kind of do that. Just I want to make sure that I show you guys on camera how to do the other one. So I'm going to get the purple now. I am going to make sure that it does have water. I'm going to make sure that it does have purple. And this is a deep color because I want those dots to be a little bit more dark rather than the background. And then I'm going to do the same technique where I'm just touching it and creating those little dots and splatters, maybe over here on this side where it doesn't have a lot of texture. And these will be more sharp. They're not going to bleed as much as the other ones, okay? And if I do that with it 100% dry, even more sharp, they're not going to bleed at all. So that's just going to be up to you guys. I probably will put a little bit more after, once it's 100% dry. Now notice that because it's copy paper, look at how delicate the paper is. It will dry, and it will also dry to the point where it's not going to have this see-through effect. I do recommend, if you don't want a lot of warping on the paper, because you know when you get paper wet and it starts to warp, if you don't want that, put this aside somewhere on another paper towels or whatever you have available, and then get a book and put it on top as it dries, so that way it dries a little bit more flat. So that's an option. As long as you put weight on it, it should dry without having all of that movement on the paper. I do recommend, if you are going to put a book on top of it, make sure that you put a paper towel on top just to protect whatever color is there. And then you can put a book on top just as it dries, okay? And this is pretty much for the background for the watercolor, guys. So I'm gonna put this off to the side because I do wanna show you some examples of where we're going with this and why I kept it light like this, because we're using it as a background, okay? So I'm gonna just move this off to the side, but like I said, I am gonna show you guys the examples of the actual artwork and what came out good and maybe what you need to avoid. For those of you guys that haven't done the watercolor yet, but you're looking at it and saying, oh, I kind of like this. Maybe I will go to Walmart and buy some. This is where it's gonna go as far as the examples. Okay, so let me zoom out a little bit more. So you guys already know that everything that stays behind with me as examples are not the best examples, okay? A lot of the stuff that people leave behind is because either one, they weren't finished or whatever, but you still get the idea of the project seeing these. So like, here's an example. They only drew one, but you can see that they kept the background and we're drawing on top. I would have, if I were to have done this, like if this was my project, I would have probably drawn a couple of eyes, like some more eyes, which you'll see on some of them that they draw multiple just to fill it in, because this is just very minimal. And you know, it's not going to get you the best grade, because where I'm also not only the background, but I'm also giving you guys the grade on what did you pick up with the drawing that I showed you. Notice they're starting to add color. So it's not just the pencil. Here's another example. This one's a little bit better done, because you notice that they added one more. Look at the actual, they wanted to do two colors. That's fine for the background. So those of you guys who did the practice right now, let's say that's not the one you want to use for your final, because now that you're looking at this and you're like, oh, I like that they put two colors, or, you know, I like that they got this particular texture, how they kind of made it look like little vine work or that sort of thing. These are things that you can kind of look at now at the examples if you guys want to try it also on your own, okay, just to get it on the final. So they drew 4 eyes. Notice they're adding colors. They went heavy on the highlights, but that's okay because it's a final. So if you guys want to change what I showed you guys about the drawing, you're more than welcome. I had, I think, a couple of people show me, they had looked up eyes on the internet, and they're like, ma'am, it's because I like the way this one looks and it has a lot of detail. You can put as much detail as you guys want. I'm just showing you guys the basics on how to draw and how to use the shapes to manipulate your objects, okay? So just because I showed you a specific way doesn't mean you can't look for a reference online to follow and make it more detailed if you wish, okay? Now, the size that they're drawing these, you can kind of see that as far as the size goes, that's why they're drawing multiple. If you want to draw one big eye, you can draw one big eye and just do one. That's fine. Like for me, this person, if they were going to just draw one, they should have just drawn it a lot larger. You know, that way they can get a better grade because then they put more detail when it comes to doing the textures inside the iris and so forth, okay? Here's another example. Now, this person wanted to use all of the things I showed them. They wanted to do the eyes, they wanted to do the fish and the flower. Very surrealistic. So if you guys want to draw all of them, you can draw all of them if you liked all of them. I just wanted to make sure that you guys learned how to draw something and learn how to use your shapes to be able to draw. But, you know, you can go as detailed as you want. You want to use them all. She kind of used, if you notice, she put them upside down to make them kind of look like teardrops. So this is kind of a good way of doing it because it is very surrealism. If you guys look up like Dali and some of these artists, you can see how something like this could be considered, you know, that surrealistic piece because it's like we've got the fish kind of floating here in space. The eyes, the way they drew the eyes almost looks like if it's like a dream, you know, like if you can kind of see a hint of somebody looking in at what's going on over here in the front. So, you know, you can take it anywhere. They used multiple colors too for the background. So you don't have to just use two. If you want to use different colors, you guys can use different colors as well. These are some of the examples that I had done in the previous years when we were drawing the fish and so forth. You can see this would be like one piece as far as like if I'm looking at it. But I drew it smaller, of course, because it was for the examples and it's what could fit on screen for everybody. But, you know, you can draw the fish different colors as well. You, depending on what you use in the color, like if I'm looking at this fish, I use the same colors as the background. So this one looks like it's floating underwater, like it's a part of it, you know, with the colors and so forth. This one's more contrast. So it's like, what do you like? Do you like contrast or do you want it to be the same tones? Or do you want both? This right here, if you do it like this, where one is versus the other color, especially how it looks a little bit bigger, it looks like it's more up in the foreground and this is in the background, like in the shadows. So these are things that you might want to think about when you guys are drawing. Now, this is color pencil. So this is what we're going to do on the next step. We're going to draw whichever animal or object that I showed you, and then we're going to apply the color pencil, which I will go over with you guys on the next video on Wednesday. Here's another example. Remember the flower I show you guys? So when we work on it on Wednesday, I'm actually going to show you guys, I showed you the simple process of how to draw a flower. Now on Wednesday, I'm going to show you guys how to use that same shading with the color pencil. So we'll be drawing on top of this using color pencil next. You can even use marker. Like if I get real close, you can notice I did a little bit of pointillism on there with marker. So you can apply as much detail as you guys want on the ones that I showed you. Here's just another one just with the fish. So if you draw the fish big enough on your paper, you know, this one is a little bit more vertical rather than horizontal. So those are things that you make the decision. Do you want a vertical? Do you want a horizontal? This person went off like on the online and found a picture. They wanted to do a dolphin rather than the actual goldfish. And I told him, that's fine, find a reference. And sure enough, this was done in class. So she didn't trace it or anything. And I saw that she was using the same method of, okay, I'm gonna do my oval shape here. I think she cut it up into a couple of oval shapes to be able to get that. She did an oval shape for the mouth. So she used the same technique that I did for the goldfish, but applied it to a dolphin. So if you want to do a different kind of fish, that's fine. I'd had people that wanted to learn how to apply that same technique using a koi fish. So if you guys want to draw a koi fish and you want to do the same thing, like change it with the shapes, you can always reach out to me and say, ma'am, how do I put the shapes on this? And I'll show you what the guide looks like so you guys can do it on the final if you guys want, okay? Here's another example. They did two. You know, it's probably missing a little bit. Like if it were me doing this, I would have added like maybe some bubbles or maybe some seaweed coming from the bottom just to kind of fill up the space. Or What probably would have helped this one a lot is adding those textures, like the little dots and stuff with the watercolor. If they would have done that first, it would have had more manipulation on this. Teachers at this time, I want you to please look around. Every student should have their mask, and every teacher on the team must have their mask. No exceptions. There's the safety and the need to follow. I like how this is coming out of the video. Okay, so, you know, and then again, this is just background. So as far as mixing colors, you are more than welcome to mix colors. Here I have green, blue, yellow, and then there's orange dots. Like if you want to go so contrasting, go for it. And the purple dots. So completely different colors that I'm using for those little dots on the actual watercolor. Now, as far as an example of somebody who got too dark, you know, just be very careful. Like they had to go super dark with the lining on this because they went a little bit too dark on the colors over here. And I don't mind people like, you know, I know at the time we were doing this, like Illuminati was like a big thing or whatever, that people were talking about that, you know, what do they call them when they're like conspiracy theories and all that stuff. And I'm like, it's fine if you want to incorporate some of that stuff, I'm okay with that. You know, there's nothing in the sense of negative other than that it's a conspiracy. But if you just make sure that if you guys do something like that or whatever, as far as the color tone is what my concern was, make sure that the drawing portion of it, I can actually see the drawing itself, because if it gets too dark, you're going to have trouble drawing on top of it. Okay. Not that you can't fix it. You know, if you already did the background and you already went too dark, ask me my opinion and I can tell you and guide you guys on ways of fixing things, you know, maybe using white in certain spots or things like that, but we'll figure out a way if you accidentally get too dark on a specific drawing. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video there.